Today, my friends, is a chilling yarn of terror where we get to learn a valuable lesson of evil. Evil, my friends, is an unseen force that works its beautiful wonders when mankind approaches it with the rewarding gift of ignorance. Evil cannot be eradicated, as so many have tried, for it lurks within the shadows of humanity, waiting for man to utilize its magnificence to craft us a wonderful story of horror. For today's story, we are about to experience a new form of evil when joining three souls who would dare brave into the frozen mountains and partake on a journey to seek out a common resolution to a mystery and to experience the inner thrill of adventure. Three hikers who are being guided by a Mr. Hamaguchi, friend and mountaineer expert, another good friend, Doi, don't know much about him honestly, and Tenimura, the one adventurer who decided to step out of his element of comfort by seeking the answers to a personal mystery of his. He is the sole reason why these three gentlemen are venturing into these frozen mountains. And as our brave adventurers maintain their course of reaching a secluded cabin before nightfall, one of these men, Mr. Doi, would suddenly spot something in the corner of his eye, taking a few seconds to make out the strange object within the distance before realizing the truth about his horrible discovery. It was a body of a dead female who had no clothing, and immediately investigating this shocking scene by racing down the steep hill to have a closer inspection. It was obvious that this was an act of murder, something that was performed by a sick-minded individual. The poor woman who was wedged between the rocks and forced to endure the suffering torment and succumb to the unforgiving temperatures that this freezing mountain had to offer. But when the woman had shown life, a sudden gaze upon her selfless hero, the miracle of resurrection and impossibility that was enough for Mr. Doi to lose his balance and disappear into the cliffs below. It was not easy pushing forward for our remaining adventurers, knowing that they just lost one of their good friends. That's what Tenimura kept telling himself, that there was nothing they could do when they saw Doi fall over the cliff. And even though Tenimura tried finding Doi, or what had become of him, which came with no success, he did have some concern with Hamaguchi's lack of attention with Doi's disappearance and fate. Instead, dwelling on the reality that they just lost a good friend, or maybe if there was something they could have done to save Doi. It seemed that Hamaguchi's attention had more focus on her, the girl who should not be alive. And yet, here she is, bundled with a spare sleeping bag, her pale body being comforted while being carried through the harsh climate by her two saviors. And even though the girl had somehow shown enough life within her to where her chances of survival were incredible, Tenimura could not help but notice how Hamaguchi was paying more attention to this strange girl instead of focusing on the right path to the cabin. It was like every pitiful response that this girl would mutter, sharing her displeasure with the cold, was more important to Hamaguchi than navigating through these mountains. Eventually, her displeasure with the cold began showing a dissatisfaction with what she was currently wrapped in, and began demanding to wear what Hamaguchi was wearing. As a novice, someone who has inexperience with these mountains, Tenimura knew that he was out of his element when deciding to venture into these mountains. But witnessing Hamaguchi strip down to his undergarments, just to please the girl's strange request on wearing his clothing, Tenimura knew all too well that this was not something any climber would do. For reasons unknown, Hamaguchi's attention for this girl was making him reckless, showing nothing but a complete disregard for his own safety because of the whims of a girl. And watching this unremarkable display of stubbornness and carelessness was now making Tenemura very concerned and a bit nervous. It was obvious that Hamaguchi was suffering incredibly. His pale skin being exposed to the freezing temperatures was taking a lethal toll on his health. Several occasions, Tenemura had tried convincing Hamaguchi into being more sensible with his actions, at least convincing him on covering himself with a blanket or even half of what Tenemura is wearing. Regardless, it seemed like there was nothing that could shake Hamaguchi's stubbornness and bizarre fascination with this girl. This girl, whoever she was, there was something not right with her. Every now and then, she would give Tenemura this strange look. Small moments of eye contact that would give a foreign chill running down his spine. Something that felt more cold than the freezing winds of this mountain. With the evening creeping over our troubled adventurers, the fearless and stubborn Hamaguchi found himself within an unfortunate situation, more like a predictable one. Regardless of his experience and knowledge with these mountains, somehow, someway, his sense of direction had failed him. They were lost. Of course, seeing how Hamaguchi had more focus on the strange girl, and that he was definitely not in his right state of mind, there was no way that the trio can venture any further, with temperatures dropping and Hamaguchi's body being exposed to the freezing cold. There was no other option but to set up camp for the night. And just as Tenemura had finally reached out and roughly bring our stubborn friend into his right state of mind, convincing him that it would be best to take a rest, that was when she stepped in and demanded to be taken to the cabin immediately. The idea of trying to reach the cabin was absurd, more like suicidal. They were already lost, and Hamaguchi had already exceeded his physical and mental limitations. There is no way this man can travel any further without suffering from fatal damages to his body. If Hamaguchi continued on like this, he will suffer greatly, most likely die. But it seemed like the whims of a beautiful princess had somehow proved more dominant. That regardless of the efforts Tenemura tried convincing his friend of the fatal consequences from his reckless decisions, to please this woman and her shocking disregard for Hamaguchi's life, it was becoming quite clear that his friend had completely lost his sense of rational thinking. A lost cause whose chances of survival was very low, becoming smaller by the minute. It didn't take long before the girl found herself slumped to her knees, lacking the effort to push forward, claiming to be incapable of going any further. And as the stubborn Hamaguchi responded to this damsel in distress by immediately offering to carry her on his back. The thing was, she didn't want to give Hamaguchi the satisfaction. Oh no, she felt that was a privilege that should be rewarded to Tenemura. Nah, she didn't really care about Hamaguchi's boastful experience as a climber, nor his pathetic display of suicidal devotion. With her experience, this pathetic act wasn't uncommon. In fact, the worship was kind of boring. But there was this peculiar interest she had for the curious novice. And besides, between the two, he was obviously the better-looking one. Of course, Tenemura had tried to reason with Hamaguchi, making another hopeless attempt of convincing the man that they need to set up camp. But when seeing Hamaguchi's irrational behavior taking on a much more violent and threatening tone, Tanemura had found himself left with no choice but to carry the girl on his back, as Hamaguchi took care of both packs and forced himself through the slow and agonizing torment. A dreadful reality that's running through Tanemura's mind, and it's no mystery, nor should it be a spoiler, but a predictable outcome that our stubborn Hamaguchi, a man who's obviously possessed, is not going to leave these mountains alive. The unforgiving cold taking its toll upon a man's flesh, organs, and immune system on the brink of failure. This was not a man whose pride had gotten the better of him, nor a man who had fallen for the whims of a beautiful woman. No, my friends, this was a man whose emotions and mentality were being controlled. No human interaction towards his horrible suffering, and yet fueled by this overwhelming obsession with her. Feelings that were so intense, giving Hamaguchi a foreign hatred for his friend that was growing by the second, that after everything Hamaguchi done for this girl, this creature of beauty that gave no attention for Hamaguchi's reckless act of selflessness and devotion, it had to be this inexperienced novice who would be rewarded with her love. How did it come to this? This weak novice who has no experience with these mountains will be the one that is honored to have such a beautiful creature clinging onto him, just by watching her enjoy the comfort of the pathetic novice was becoming more unbearable by the minute, a torment that was worse than the freezing temperatures wasting away his vulnerable flesh, an inner hatred that was graduating into something deadly. Just by looking at her, Hamaguchi could tell that there was this forbidden love she had for this pathetic novice. And when Tanemura finally decided to take a stand against this madness, refusing to go any further without setting up camp, looking upon Hamaguchi was a sight that gave Tanemura a new form of fear. Just by looking at his friend and his frail body, his deathly stare, this was not the same man Tanemura had known. This was a man who was cursed with a madness, his sanity and ability of rational thought being dominated by this incredible taste for murder. And as Hamaguchi began spewing his vile curses for being deprived the very thing he so craved, her warming touch, her love, after everything, she would dare give it all to this pathetic, whiny, undeserving novice. Which is why Hamaguchi had decided that instead of setting up camp, or even finding the cabin, it would be a much better idea to cut the woman in half, and that was when the mountains would be blessed with the screams of a woman as the sounds of distress would be faded away by the freezing winds. Thankfully, the girl had only suffered a deep cut on her arm when Hamaguchi attacked her with his axe before running off into the mountains. It just didn't make any sense as to why Hamaguchi would suddenly go crazy. This was not normal for somebody who had years of experience as a climber. And as Tanemura reluctantly followed Hamaguchi's trail with the girl on his back, desperately trying to find his crazed friend, it must have been a good 30 to 40 minutes before Tanemura's worst of fears would be confirmed, when stumbling upon the remains of his friend. Hamaguchi was a good man, whose mind was bent, and whose body had fell to his depraved madness, falling victim to this frozen hell. But just a few yards away from this tragic scene was a miracle. They had finally reached the cabin. So now that we've come to the part of our story where our remaining couple can embrace each other's company and be free from the frozen horrors outside this miserable, isolated cabin, an appropriate time to be rewarded with some answers as we solve the mysteries behind Tenemura and this strange girl, who'd somehow miraculously healed from her severe cut. Anyways, the truth about Tenemura. Truth is, well, he's someone who's not really into this mountain climbing thing. It's not what he would call an ideal fun vacation, or conquering a personal challenge when pushing himself to the limits. No. What exactly dragged Tenemura into these mountains was the efforts of seeking out his missing brother. You see, usually it's Hamaguchi, Doi, and his brother that would go on these mountain climbing adventures. But a month ago, Tenemura's brother ended up going missing. Nobody knew what had became of him, except for one witness who claimed that they saw the man going into these mountains alone. At first, it was unbelievable that Tenemura's brother would venture into these mountains by himself, saying how he was an experienced climber, and even though Doi and Hamaguchi had a hard time believing this, so far, it was the only lead Tenemura had in solving the mystery behind his brother's disappearance, which was somehow enough for Tenemura into convincing Hamaguchi and Doi into joining him on traveling into these unforgiving mountains, hopefully seeking out a resolution to this personal mystery. And for obvious reasons, you could say that this ended up becoming a desperate act that Tenemura heavily regrets. And as the freezing night ascended on the bleak cabin, Tenemura could not help but notice these inner feelings he had for this strange girl. At a time like this, they were feelings that felt so inappropriate, more like forbidden. And yet, Tenemura just could not shake away the idea that she knew about these inner thoughts that was ripping a wound into his mentality. Finding herself embracing the warming comforts of this handsome young man during such a cold night, content with these reluctant urges that were toying and tormenting with the boy's mind and sanity. Interesting how Tenemura never gotten around into knowing her name, which was Tomie. As for her story, as to why Tomie was found wedged between them rocks, in the nude, you may think that Tomie was there for about an hour or two at most. Nope. She was there for about a month. It was because of her boyfriend. He was the reason why Tomie was found like that. Brought her into these mountains, far away from human civilization, and left her all over these mountains. All over in pieces. Meaning that Tomie's boyfriend had cut her up into small pieces and threw him away into several parts within these mountains. How Tomie remembered her boyfriend would always tell her how much he loved her and how much of a burden she was. Kinda humiliating that it would all come to this. So being brought back to life, it was revenge that Tomie craved. A thought that kind of made her wonder if her boyfriend would see her as a vengeful ghost or something. But when Tomie was found by this curious trio, there was something about Tenemura she found very fascinating. For some reason, Tenemura strongly resembled her boyfriend, especially with the eyes, which is why Tomie wanted to have this moment alone with this handsome young man in the cabin. And even though Tomie still withheld a vengeful hate for her boyfriend, she just couldn't help but cling onto these feelings of love for the man. His name? Why, his name was Tetsuya Tenemura. If I'm not mistaken, the name should be familiar to somebody else within that cabin. harsh elements that would deprive men from a peaceful night of slumber, challenged their involuntary desire for rest. Tenemura was robbed of his valuable moment of physical, mental recovery when being rewarded to an unsettling horror. This woman, Tomie, a creature of undeniable beauty. How could she have known his brother? At first, he thought that Tomie may have lost her rational state of mind when sharing her unbelievable story. But yet, Tenemura just could not shake away the feeling that she was speaking the truth. A lie that held a permanent domination towards Tenemura's feelings of doubt. Could it be true that his brother performed the unthinkable by chopping this girl into pieces, went into these mountains alone so that he could dispose her? It just didn't make any sense, and for some reason, Tenemura could not shake away the feeling that there was absolute truth behind Tomie's story. Watching her slumber through this unforgiving night, there was something else that Tenemura could not shake away when overlooking this sleeping beauty. The forbidden feelings he had for this girl. Feelings of an undeniable love? Maybe. And for reasons unknown, these feelings were escalating by the minute. It was like Tenemura was losing control of his emotions, a sense of direction. Options were wearing thin, struggling with these infectious urges of lust, the irresistible taste for murder. If these words were true, if his brother had killed this woman because of how she was a burden, you may not make sense of it. I don't think anybody can. But for our boy Tenemura, it was all becoming clear now. His brother, he killed this woman out of love. And grabbing a knife from his bag, gripping it with reluctance, overwhelmed by the strong desire to submerge himself within these dreadful temptations. Is this love that Tenemura is experiencing? True love? And before a sliver of Tenemura's sanity would answer that question, the slumbering night would suddenly be interrupted by a violent scream, for our dear boy had just snapped back into reality. Into his horror, Tenemura had realized what he'd done. Didn't know why he would do such a thing. What came over him? And watching Tomie clench and writhe in pain, grasping the very knife that was bringing her before death, more like a reintroduction, watching Tomie wasting away her final moments, pleading before her murderer, shock and anger filling her eyes. Those eyes, which were not only filled with rage, but were now inhuman. For Tomie's love horribly faded away, slipped away from Tenemura's fingers, her final breath vowing that she will never forgive him for what he'd done. The horrors of reality was now an intense burden for Tenemura, for our boy had lost against his struggle with these forbidden urges before crossing the threshold of being defined as a murderer. Like any normal reaction to such an act, Tenemura was now letting the feelings of confusion, panic, and fear guide him through this horrible event, not knowing how to cope with the fact that there is now blood on his hands. For reasons unknown, reasons that cannot be explained, Tenemura had just committed murder. So Tenemura did what any inexperienced murderer would do. Let cowardice be the driving factor of his choices and leave behind the remains of his horrid act. Her final words: she will never forgive him. Why were these words such an unbearable torment for Tenemura? After what he'd done, Tenemura still had this inner desire to be forgiven, to love and be loved. And as our boy practically fled into the mountains, leaving behind the physical remnants of his inner demons, Tenemura's lack of experience and knowledge had decreased his chances of easily finding a way through these unbearable mountains, letting the day wasting away as the weather took its toll on Tenemura's strive of escaping this horror story. Unfortunately, it seemed that fatigue had gotten the better of our inexperienced climber, forcing the boy to seize the moment of getting some rest by setting up camp. And when investigating a small area near the rocky cliff, the perfect idea for a shelter, our boy Tenemura was about to learn a horrible lesson when it comes to running away from your demons. Stumbling upon a frozen body, the very thing that dragged Tenemura into the heart of this freezing hell, he was finally reunited with his missing brother. He's been dead for a very long time. But there was more to this shocking mystery, my friends, an unremitting horror that was hiding beneath the blanket, partially covering the lower remains of his brother. And as our troubled boy removed the blanket, what he uncovered was something that should have remained forbidden, introduced to an evil that had a familiar appearance. It was her, Tomie, or what was left of her, consuming his brother's flesh. But the thing was, it was not the same Tomie he had killed in the cabin. This creature, showing no care for the shy boy who was fortunate enough to find her within such a delightful moment of obtaining a full recovery. Watching this horrid act had Tenemura slowly make sense of this strange woman, her power, and her inability to die. Whoever or whatever this beautiful creature was, Tenemura remembered the feelings he had within the cabin, the absence of having control over his sanity and actions, watching this woman maintain her feast upon his brother's flesh. I think there was a part within Tenemura, a thought hidden behind the realization that he was going to die within these mountains. There was a lot of focus on the possibility that Tenemura can love and be loved.